Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Well, welcome to the Skeptic Zone, where we're shortly away from the melee crowd. Richard has been signing autographs and doing things with DNA you would not believe. But here we are with Richard Saunders. Richard, 3, 2, 1, you're on.
Hello and welcome to the Skeptic Zone, episode number 190, Maynard. Can you believe it? 190.
10 more and we get a fruitcake.
Well, there are enough fruitcakes in the Skeptic Zone, I think, Maynard. But an interesting show coming up this week. Most of it recorded live here at, which you can hear in the background, Sydney Skeptics in the pub.
At the Coronation Hotel, first Thursday of every month.
Yes, that's right. We're going to kick off with Eran, Segev, the president of Australian Skeptics and our reporter, giving a talk here at Skeptics in the pub all about skepticism and evidence.
Well, look, and I want to pin him down and talk about some counterintuitive things that goes against his argument.
You do?
Yeah, I'll probably lose, but I don't mind losing an argument.
Well, you're the sort of fruitcake we need on the Skeptic Zone, then, I think.
And what else have we got on the show?
It's you. It's your spooky action at a distance asking questions here at the pub.
Yes, I've been asking people some monumental questions, and I can't understand any of their answers, but you edited it up, and I'm sure it'll be cool.
But our listeners will understand, Maynard. That's the important thing.
Oh, and look, once more, I want to throw out to everyone out there, I am going to TAM. Thank you to the generosity of the listeners.
Thank you indeed.
And if there is any question you want me to ask of any particular person, email me and let me know so I can ask it for them.
That's right. Now, where should they email you, Maynard?
Look, they can send it through my website at Maynard.com.au, or they can send it to the Skeptic Zone, and if I find that person, I know I'll be meeting George Harabo. Now I'll be meeting Mr. Spa Thinker himself, the guy whose brain never fails.
You mean Dunning?
Dunning, the mighty Dunning.
Good heavens.
I'll be talking to him.
Yeah.
And maybe perhaps James Randi himself. And I really want to talk to Penn Jillette. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I'm going to try.
Oh, it might happen. We'll see what we can arrange. Absolutely.
So if you've got questions for those people, I'll try and take them and ask them for you. It's the least I can do for the listeners for helping get me there.
Thank you again, listeners. It's because of you that Maynard is going to Las Vegas. Fantastic work. But I think, Maynard, we've waffled on long enough, and I'm sure the listeners are out there. They're in their stop waffling on. They're in their cars. They're jogging. They're doing the dishes. They're cleaning the house. What else are our listeners doing?
They've got their earbuds deep inside their canals.
Yes, and they're dying to hear the Skeptic Zone. So I'm going to go back to the bar, grab another glass of champagne, and we can all enjoy the Skeptic Zone.
Let's all take this with a grain of salt. Here's Eran Segev.
Grain of salt now. Grain of salt, you gotta take it with a...
There's no need to introduce today's speaker because it's me. So my name is Eran and I'm the president of Australian Skeptics. The subject of my talk today is about assessing evidence. Now, the reason I started thinking about that in the past, obviously we're all interested in evidence, that's what skeptics do, but the reason I really started to concentrate on that is because I received Google alerts related to Australian skeptics, and what I noticed was that a lot of the alerts I was getting were related to climate change skeptics who happen to be Australians, and there's plenty of those. There's also been recently, you're probably aware that Meryl Dorey, this is the time where everybody says, "Goo." Yeah, exactly. She's opened a website, which is called AustralianSkeptics.com, and the title of the website is The Real Australian Skeptics. Now, such misuses of the word skeptic are not new, and part of the problem is that they can't even be considered to be completely illegitimate, because there is probably one interpretation of the word or one definition of the word that would refer to it as being simply doubting. But when we speak about skepticism in this room, I think we're all clear that what it really means is that we look at evidence and we try to find out what's true and what's not true. That's what we want to know. What's the distinction between true and false? And that distinction between true and false is made based on evidence. So if you care about what's true and false, you have to learn how to evaluate evidence. And when there is some claim that attracts enough evidence, it is appropriate for a scientific skeptic or a critical thinker to suspend skepticism, to say, I'm not as skeptical about this anymore, and I give this, whatever it is that we're talking about, provisional acceptance. And that's a very important point. We don't say anything is ever 100% true, but we give it provisional acceptance based on the available evidence. But it has to be supported by sufficient evidence and good quality evidence. And that's where we come to the point of saying, what is good quality evidence? How do we judge the evidence? I'd like to give an example of such a situation that is to do with climate change. Climate change is a very complex topic. It's not a single science. It's got, if you look at what comprises climate science, you're talking about something that comprises atmospheric science, oceanography, glaciology, geology, physics, chemistry, even astronomy is involved in this, and I've probably left a few ologies out. The thing is that there isn't probably a single person in the world who knows something about all of these things, enough to properly evaluate all the evidence. And even if you look at being able to evaluate partial evidence that encompasses several of these areas, you would find that the number of people around the world who really grasp the science is very small. I'd be surprised if it's more than a few thousand people that really grasp all of the science. Yet, if you talk to people anywhere, definitely in this room, people who have a lot of opinions, they'll have an opinion about climate change. And I'm not talking about having an opinion about climate change in the sense of, oh, I don't like carbon tax, I don't like the carbon tax, or oh, I do like the carbon tax. I'm talking about saying, yeah, the science is true or the science is not true. I don't think that's an accident. I think the reason people form an opinion about something like climate change is because they feel very strongly about it. It's something that could affect our life. And there is also a sense in the media, there's a confusing message in the media about how big it is. And, like, if it's true, we're all going to die. Which is, by the way, true, we are all going to die, but not because of climate change. So people want to be involved in the debate. It's something very important. How do you get involved in a debate if you don't have an opinion? It's a bit silly. You just sit there and listen and say, oh, yeah, maybe you're right. Oh, no, maybe you're right. People form an opinion basically because they want to be involved and they want to be part of the debate. The problem is that, as Carl Sagan once said, he said about, somebody asked him what his gut feeling was about something, and he said, I try not to think with my gut, I try to think with my brain. The problem is that obviously the only way you can, if you don't understand the evidence, if you're unable to judge the evidence for yourself, you're in the end resorting to thinking with your gut. And that's obviously not a good idea. So what do? If you're an interested person, interested citizen, and you want to know what's going on, you want to form an informed opinion, but you're not enough of an expert, or you don't know enough about the science to actually judge whether something is true or false. You need to to assess the evidence, but you can't because you're not an expert. So what do? Well, what I'd like to speak about today is actually a few rules of thumb for assessing evidence. And before I start, I want to point out that these rules of thumb do not apply every time. Definitely not all of them apply all the time. And there are some cases where they do not apply at all. I could probably think of some cases where they don't apply at all. But as a guide, they're pretty good for assessing evidence on areas in which you feel that you need to form an opinion. I'll move away from climate change for a little bit because I don't want anybody to... I don't want to start a fight here, but I'll start with simpler topics. So some of them will not be even from the realm of science. Let's start with rule number 1. The first rule is Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a principle that says that entities shall not be multiplied unnecessarily. Now, a less 14th century way of saying that is that a simpler explanation takes precedence over a more complex one. I'll give you an example. There are errors of policy or neglect by governments. You could take those to be the result of some grand conspiracy. Or you could say that they're the result of something like bad luck, laziness, thoughtlessness, incompetence. Now, the first one, a conspiracy, requires you to assume some grand design, long-term planning, flawless execution, and the ability to keep a secret for a very, very long time by government. The other one requires you to expect that people in government, remember, government is not some organization, some body. It's people. It's made out of people. It requires people in government to have normal human frailties. So I'm sure you all understand where I'm going with this, but basically one is simple and straightforward, and the other one requires a much more elaborate explanation that probably requires us to go a little bit further and deeper and raises more questions. Another example is evolution versus creation. Evolution produces amazingly complex results. People who are capable of deciding to go to a pub on Thursday, for example. But despite the complex results, the process itself is actually very simple. All that's required to start evolution is some semi-stable replicators, and the likes of which were the precursors to the DNA in the cells of every living thing. Creation requires one very, very short word, that is God. Now, God is a very simple explanation if you're in a spelling contest. But if you're actually trying to explain evolution, it isn't simple at all. It raises a whole host of new questions. It is not a simple explanation. It's a very large assumption that needs to be explained in its own right, and is therefore complicates matters quite significantly, and is therefore not a suitable explanation based on Occam's razor. Now, obviously, it is possible for the more complex explanation to be true as opposed to the simpler one. But for that to happen requires quite extraordinary circumstances. And if we talk about extraordinary circumstances, I have to quote Carl Sagan once again in what's called Sagan's balance. Carl Sagan said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that is our second rule. An example of an extraordinary claim is that if you take a substance and you dilute it in water to such a degree where there's not even a single molecule left of the original material, where you basically have water, that material, that dilution will somehow cure the same symptoms that the original material would have caused. Of course, that's what homeopaths claim happens. That's what homeopathy is all about. And if that were true, then, for example, caffeine diluted to such a degree to homeopathic levels would cure insomnia. And indeed, that's what homeopaths say it does. But it doesn't. Now, the reason that this claim is extraordinary is not just because it sounds funny. It's because for it to be true requires almost everything we know about physics, chemistry, physiology, and pharmacology to be wrong. Not just a little bit wrong, but completely wrong. Which means that it's extremely implausible that homeopathy would be true. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's extremely implausible. If you had a mountain of strong evidence showing that homeopathy is true, then it would be true. It's just that, obviously, there is no such evidence. All the evidence shows that homeopathy is not just implausible, it's also false and doesn't work. The most common type of evidence for the likes of homeopathy is in the form of testimonials. Another word for testimonials is anecdotes. I'll give you an example of such an anecdote. My son got the MMR vaccine and it caused him to become autistic. It's a very common testimonial in the anti-vaccine movement. And the problem with such an anecdote is that it doesn't take into account a lot of things that can happen. For example, one of the reasons that a lot of children, that link between autism and vaccines is made is because autism, definitely profound autism, is very often diagnosed around the age of 2 or 3, a time when kids receive a lot of vaccines. Now, the fact that two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that they're necessarily related. And an anecdote doesn't have the ability to distinguish between just two things happening together by chance or because there's a causal relationship between them. Millions of children receive millions of vaccines every year. Now, some of them will be diagnosed as autistic at the same time. So you could say, oh, well, it was caused because of that. But the reality is that some of the children will at the same time be diagnosed as being very bright. Some of them will be diagnosed as being short-sighted. Some of them will be diagnosed as being, will have a weak leg or something else. Some of them will have cancer around that time. It happens. The thing is that to show a relationship between them, you need to do some statistics. And statistics, by its very nature, cannot be done on one case. And an anecdote is one case. For example, in the case of what we're talking about here, autism caused by vaccinations, what you need is to compare large populations of vaccinated children against non-vaccinated children and to see whether the prevalence or incidence of autism is different between the two groups. The answer, by the way, is no, it isn't. The next rule is that is based on that, and that is the multiple of anecdote is not evidence. And the corollary to that, by the way, is that a single anecdote is definitely not evidence. So if somebody comes to you and says, oh, well, but it happened to me, I'll say, well, good on you, but I won't take that as evidence to anything because you may be completely correct, and it may even be true that there is a causal relationship there, but your anecdote does not prove that. The next rule, the fourth rule, is that experts do know more. If you want to fix something electrical in your house, you can go to somebody who has gone to TAFE for a few years to study to be an electrician, then did an apprenticeship for a few years, and then spent the last 10 years putting many kilometers of cables and switch boxes and all kinds of things around houses everywhere. Or you could take some kind of handyman who can replace a faulty socket. And I think everybody in this room would accept, and not just in this room, I think most people in the world would accept that the electrician knows a lot more about electricity and about electrical work than the handyman. Because he's an expert. It's what he's been doing. It's what he has he's retained a lot of knowledge over the years that he's been doing it. Similarly, a GP knows more about vaccinations than somebody who has a brain or claims to have a brain and has been doing research on Google. And an expert on infectious diseases knows more about vaccinations than the GP because it's his specialty. That's what he's been doing or she's been doing. And that's what they've been studying. So experts do know more. And by the way, because I've already mentioned climate science, I should mention that a veteran atmospheric scientist knows more about climate change than a geologist. And it's not because geology doesn't have anything to do with climate change. It's because it has a lot less to do with climate change than atmospheric science. Listening to a specialist, expert, is not foolproof. And we'll talk in a moment about the whole issue of argument from authority. When you listen to you choose your expert and you listen to just one person, that's an issue in its own right. But if you have to choose between listening to that guy I mentioned earlier, or that girl in the case that we know very well, who claims to have a brain and to be doing research on the internet, choose the expert, because the expert is much more likely to lead you down the right path. The fifth rule is a bit of an amalgamation of the previous rules, and in particular it's something that takes care of the issue of argument from authority, and that is trust science. Not a scientist, but science in general. Now, obviously, when I talk about science in the context of this talk, I'm referring not to the science of chemistry or the science of physics. I'm talking about the scientific method. I'm talking about the process of science, which is obviously a self-correcting process in which the ultimate goal of the participants is to determine whether something is true or not, what the evidence shows. And the final arbiter of what's true or not is the evidence. Not one person thinks or another person thinks. Now, since the participants in this process, which we also know as scientists, are human, the process doesn't always run smoothly or flawlessly. There's always problems along the way. So you do find faulty argument, you do find faulty papers, you do find faulty research along the way. But time and again, the self-correcting method of principles of science ensure that over time, and through a lot of research by many different people, we actually get closer and closer to the truth. A great example of that is the famous case of Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who, despite what everybody knew for many years, that peptic ulcers were caused by stress, found that peptic ulcers were actually caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori, and that it can be treated by antibiotics. It wasn't accepted straight away. It took a while. It was common knowledge. It was a consensus that stress was causing ulcers, and it took them a while to prove it. But once they proved it, everybody changed their mind. You will not find a single well, maybe a single, you will find, yeah. Somebody who also doesn't vaccinate. But you'll find maybe a few doctors. But the vast majority of scientists and doctors and medical professionals of various kinds will accept now that when you have ulcers, you need to take antibiotics, and you get treatment, and that will resolve the problem. And these things happen. You have some idea, you have some hypothesis, you have some thought about the way things are, like stress causes ulcers, and and then the facts are shown, the evidence is shown, and that hypothesis, that theory goes away. T.H. Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, once said something that I really like. He said that the tragedy of science is a beautiful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. So obviously in this case there's no ugly and beautiful, but that's what's important. The facts are what's important. Now, it's worth knowing or pointing out that scientific knowledge doesn't evolve in a vacuum. We know a lot about science. We have a lot of science when we start to interrogate a specific question, and we have to rely on that. I want to ask you a question here. How do we know the moon... Okay, before 1969, how did we know the moon was not made of green cheese? You hear the question? Before 1969, how did we know the moon was not made of green cheese? Sorry? Spectroscopy. Okay. Yeah. Ian? Theory. Okay. Well, just a theory. Joel says it didn't taste good. So we had three answers here: spectroscopy, theory, and that it didn't taste so good. Now, I want to give you the answer, and it will sound like I'm being facetious, but I'm not. The reason we knew, very good. Somebody said it was implausible. The reason we know it was not made of green cheese is because it's absurd to think that it's made of green cheese. We know enough about planetary formation. We know about gravity. We know enough about cheese. Yeah, we know enough about cheese to know that it's so extremely unlikely that the moon is made of green cheese that it's not worth considering. Yeah, absolutely true. But you mentioned spectroscopy. We knew the science of spectroscopy. There was previous science that allowed us to assess the moon without actually going there. Now, in 1969, we went there. We landed. Well, not we. Neil landed and didn't get stuck into the cheesy surface of the moon. So now we know for sure. But just like you mentioned yourself, we had science that was available to us that allows us to assess it before we actually looked into it in more detail. So we have a fairly good idea of what the moon is made of, and it's not cheese. Yeah, Rachel was looking forward to her next trip to the moon. For a non-scientist to evaluate the state of the art on a specific scientific question requires to evaluate essentially two questions. Now, one of them is, has proper scientific process been followed? And so, in other words, were there no obvious failings in the process of arriving at a certain conclusion? And the other one is whether there is a scientific consensus on the topic that we're discussing. Both questions need to be answered in the affirmative, or at least not answered in the negative, for us to say, yes, it looks like we know what the answer is about science at the moment. I want to talk about scientific consensus. It's a bit of a controversial term. People very often think that it's something to do with democracy in science. Nothing like that at all. A scientific consensus arises when the majority of working scientists in a specific field or area, and the majority of organizations in that specific field or area, and the vast majority of scientific papers regarding that area all point in roughly the same direction. And the word roughly is very important. They don't all have to point due north. It's okay if some of them point northeast, some of them northwest. But very few, if there are very, very few out of, let's say, thousands, and only 3 point south, and all the rest point between northeast and northwest, then we can be pretty sure that that's the general direction we're looking at. If we talk about climate change as an example, what we have here is science that's been investigated for something like 50, some claim 75 years, but definitely in the past 50 years, it's been looked at. And over that time, there was no consensus to begin with. Definitely no consensus. The consensus really only started to emerge in the last 15 years or so. Maybe even, you might even claim that it's just the last 10 years, but definitely 15 years. It hasn't arisen easily or quickly. It has taken time. And that's the way it should be. Scientists are, by their very nature, skeptical. When there's some new idea presented to them, they will want to see the evidence. And it's been a hard slog to find all the evidence. First of all, it's difficult to collect that evidence. Secondly, it's difficult to analyze that evidence. And then there were not that many scientists in the field. And the number of scientists and the amount of science in the field has grown over time. And more scientists came to appreciate that the evidence suggests a certain thing. Basically, what we're saying here is that over time, over the last 50 years, more and more scientists who are experts in the field of climate became convinced by the evidence. Okay, so that's what a scientific consensus means. And that's a really important point. The experts are convinced by the evidence. That's a very strong point in favor of the scientific consensus. Now, obviously, we don't want to fall for something, when there's something that's controversial, we want to listen to what the scientists thought before the controversy and after the controversy and see whether there's a difference there. But generally, scientists tend to, overall, as a consensus, get it right. Specifically with climate change, I've mentioned the process. I don't think there's any particular reason to suspect that due process hasn't been followed. It's very difficult to assess the process without looking at specific papers or specific research. And that, as I mentioned, is very difficult for most of us. I know that if I tried to read some papers regarding ice core sampling. It meant so little to me that I felt that I could easily be convinced either way by these papers. If the same paper, if the conclusion, the abstract, went one way or the other, I would be equally convinced because it just meant so little to me. And I think most people are like that unless they are in a specific field. They can't assess the evidence for themselves. Basically, I have to rely to a certain extent on the science. But we can look at the way the research was done and try to see if there's obvious holes in the way it was conducted. In the case of climate change, climate science, there is a bit of an idea that there's maybe either a mass delusion or a conspiracy among climate scientists to suggest that climate change by human causes is actually happening. But that is a huge claim in its own right. And to say that there is such a conspiracy or mass delusion, you need to present evidence. And I don't believe that there's evidence that's been presented for that, despite quite a few attempts to do that. And also remember that suggesting a conspiracy contradicts at least two of the previous rules. So just be aware of that. Since both questions in the case of climate change have been answered in the affirmative, the theory of climate change by human-induced carbon forcing is likely to be correct to the best of the current scientific knowledge. And I've chosen these words very carefully. That's the current knowledge. It doesn't mean it's necessarily true. It doesn't mean that it will always hold true, but it means that we have to grant it provisional acceptance if we are skeptics. The last rule, and that's a very important rule, without which all the rest are not important, is that you have to be willing to change your mind. If you come into this process of trying to assess the evidence and you're not willing to change your mind, what will happen is that you will find all the evidence to support your position. That's what people do. It's natural. There's nothing strange about that. That's what most people will do naturally. The thing is, you have to try to be completely open-minded to evidence, but not obviously open-minded to just any claim. And that's not an easy thing to do. I've thought long and hard about times that I have changed my mind about something that was important to me, something that I felt strongly about. And I came up with one example, but I'd like you all to think about examples of your own, whether you've changed your mind about something that you felt very strongly about, and then contrary evidence came to light and you changed your mind. My example is to do with pain research on rats. I strongly believed that pain research on rats was both unethical and useless, because the rat brain is so different to ours that I just felt that it was just, why would you hurt rats when you can't find anything about the human brain because of it? That was the way I've thought about it for years. That was my my view, and I felt that it was strongly supported by science. I actually knew what was happening in labs with rats. I knew how in order to study pain in rats, strangely enough, you have to hurt them, and which is something that I felt was not. You have to only do it if it's absolutely if the results of the studies are valuable to you. And I felt that wasn't the case. One day we had dinner with friends, and one of the friends brought her parents with her, and they're both professors of biology. And somehow the conversation turned to pain and then to rats, and I said what I thought about pain research in rats. And one of the professors said, I think the wording was, everything we know about pain comes from research on rats. And I kind of smiled smugly and debated it for a while, and it became quite clear that the professor knew what he was talking about. And I went and did some more research and looked at it, looked at the volume of papers, looked at what some of the papers said, and it became quite clear that I was simply wrong. I wasn't a little bit wrong. I wasn't, just maybe not looking at it the right way exactly. I was completely wrong. Indeed, as the professor said, everything we know about pain in humans it comes from research on rats. I've changed my mind, and it's something that was a very strong point for me, being able to actually have an example like that. And I urge you to all find an example like that. First of all, so that when somebody challenges you to say, oh yeah, so when did you ever change your mind? You can have something in your toolkit for that. But also because I think it's an empowering thing personally to know that you can change your mind about something that you feel strongly about when evidence is presented that contradicts your previous knowledge. And finally, there's a couple of things I want to say that are not directly related. But first of all, with regards to climate change, I want to emphasize that accepting the science does not mean that you also accept the carbon tax. It's a political question. It's got nothing to do with the science. And all I talked about here today was to do with evaluating evidence. It has nothing to do with the political system. I don't believe the political system is subject to evidence. Not because it can't be, just because it isn't. And finally, remember, you don't have to form an opinion. If you don't know enough, if you don't feel that you know enough to assess the evidence, then the best thing to do is to not have an opinion. Say, I don't have an opinion. When I am able to assess the evidence, when I have properly assessed the evidence, then I will form an opinion. Until then, I simply don't have one. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Tim Farley. You probably know me from whatstheharm.net, a catalog of the real-world harm caused by lack of critical thinking. But that's not my only project. I present at Skeptic events. I post a daily Skeptic history fact on Twitter and Facebook. And I blog about using new techniques on the internet to advance skepticism. Come over to skeptools.com and check out my latest ideas. But first, enjoy the rest of the Skeptic Zone.
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
We're here at Skeptics at the pub, and tonight the question is, how do you defend being a skeptic? Because when you eventually come out and tell people you're a skeptic, after they try and figure out what it is, they're going to ask you, what's that all about? What do you say?
All my friends know already, but basically I tell them that it's not necessarily denying things, it's just requiring evidence before you believe something. And
do you ever find yourself a bit of the butt of the joke? Oh, he won't believe that, he's a skeptic, that kind of stuff?
Not really, no.
Okay. You've got some good friends there.
Although I did give a visiting Jehovah's Witness a good pizzling last Saturday. So.
Oh, now, did you invite them in and then had a debate with them?
Oh, no, I argued with them for about 3/4 of an hour out the front door. So.
No. And how do you think it went?
My ultimate life goal is to convert one.
Well, look, I have heard of it happening.
And basically, he reverted to God is magic and can't be explained by science.
So did you beat him to a standstill, then they looked at their watch and said we should be somewhere else?
Pretty much, you had to move on.
Oh, okay. I bet you must look forward to religious representatives coming to your house.
I quite enjoy it, actually. Like I said, my ultimate goal is to convert one, so...
Well, look, let us know, and we'll put that up on the website.
Yeah.
That 1-0 it'll be.
Yeah, it will be.
Okay, thank you. I'm here with Steve, and we've got the Wonder Dog sniffing at me because he can smell my dad's cat on me, or something anyway. Maybe I've been rolling in bacon again. But Steve, how do you defend being a skeptic when you eventually come out or you let people know that you're a part of it? People ask, what's that all about? And like, what do you do that for? What do you say?
Well, I haven't had too much trouble with people sort of getting aggressive about it, but usually I just tell people the main reason I'm a skeptic is I like to know how things work, and I want to have a correct understanding of how things work. And the main criticism I've ever really had is not so much at my skepticism, but at how I poo-poo things that other people like. I'm told you should just leave people alone, let them think what they want. And that's
so you've been accused of harshing people's mellow, have you?
Yes. And that's probably the only thing I've really been put on the spot to try and defend. And my defence of that is those people are allowed to vote. So I care what they believe in. I want, if people are going to be able to influence the government, the world around me, that I want them to be thinking rationally. I don't want to be living in a world where I'm oppressed because of silly beliefs.
That's a tough call. I mean, for goodness sake, Lara Bingle has a TV show. I mean, really. I mean, it's an ugly world that evidence is not often given the weight it should have.
No, it isn't, but that's just how it goes. And I'm certainly not in the camp of saying these people should have to take an IQ test before they can vote. I think everyone needs to be able to vote and have their voices heard, but I think it's important to make sure that those voices are speaking the truth as often as possible.
Well, how do you defend being a skeptic? When you came out as a skeptic and people went, oh, what? What did you say?
When I came out, that's
really
funny.
Oh, look, she's causing enough trouble as it is. Now she's a skeptic.
Well, actually, it's really interesting because when I discovered skepticism, it was a real revelation to me, and I took to it like a religion, and I was very evangelical. And it really didn't go down well. So, just looking at people's reactions.
So did people call you a Dawkins botherer, did they?
No, not at all. It was just you could see the eyes, drifting away. You could see them disconnecting. You could see that they weren't really engaged in the way I was. And, we're always talking in the skeptical community of how to win hearts and minds. So that was actually a really good on the frontline example of how not to do it, be evangelical. So I think when people ask me about being a skeptic, I just give them a very straight explanation of what we do, what the Australian skeptics do. I give a very calm and measured explanation, and I explain also what fun it is and how interesting it is, and how we have a ball and have a really good time, and how we try and do good and in the health sphere and consumer protection and what have you. And people are much more receptive to that, I find. At least they listen, they take it on board, and I think they're more likely to go away and look into it.
Do you think maybe the skeptics need a mascot? I mean, most football teams have a mascot. I'm not talking about a cheerleader, some sort of like a big hypodermic or something. I don't know.
Oh, I think that'd be too scary, don't you think?
It would be. It would scare the children even more.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, look, I think we'll work on the issue of a mascot at a later date.
Yeah, good idea. It's a deal.
Well, I became a skeptic by wanting to learn debating techniques, and I googled how to argue, and I found the article written by Stephen Novella from the Skeptic's Guide, and the article's been up there for a long time, and it's titled How to Argue, and that's where I discovered logical fallacies, and that led me on to reading more and more about skepticism. So to defend, the reason I would say why I'm a skeptic now is simply I just want to know what's going on.
look, my first year at university, I went to the University of New England, and at the age of 16, and the university newspaper that's that had a welcome from the chaplain, in which he said all the usual sort of chaplain-y things, and I instantly wrote a response. Saying, I can't remember what I said. I've read it again recently, and it was quite intelligent, querying the whole religious thing. This, in the University of England in 1959, was quite startling, actually, I think. So, yeah, I came out quite early.
And how did you explain your position to people then, where they're going, oh, look, do you have to make so much trouble? It's probably something you've got.
No, actually, people don't in Australia like to challenge questions and topics, and certainly not there. I did start a rationalist society with a friend, but we didn't get very far with it. But I must say that Russell Ward, who was Professor of History, noted Australian historian, stopped in the corridor, going down the aisle in the history lecture and said, were you the one who wrote that? And I said, yes. He said, good on you, and you can do history honours, even though I should have failed first year history.
Approval from authority.
It was great approval because very few people there were able to say that sort of thing, I think.
And what is the best way to sum up being a skeptic when people do ask you in one sentence? Is there one?
Just using your intelligence to question the sort of things that other people are very definite about. In the case of religion, for example, given the fact that I think God has got a real problem with PR, with public relations, because he hasn't actually made it quite clear which version of God that so many people are so fundamentally sure about is actually the accurate one. So I think an almighty God who can't actually get his message out very clearly isn't very convincing.
Yes. Well, there's considerable difference between the Lutheran Church and Islam, for example.
Precisely that. And so, an almighty God ought to be able to at least be fairly clear about what his message is, and he's not. So that's in the terms of religion. But for other subjects too, I think, there's just... And I understand that people want to hang on to opinions out of gut feelings, out of emotion and so on. But when there's so many contradictions going, I've got a brain, I want to use it, and I want to be able to work it out for myself.
Look, we've got a visitor from Melbourne here who's enjoying Skeptics in the Pub. It's all happening at the Coronation Hotel here. Right now we've got all sorts of things happening that I can't describe to you because it's radio. Best you imagine it with the theatre of your mind. John, how do you defend being a skeptic when people, when you come out to people about being one?
Well, I don't know that actually... I've never really get challenged by it. I think largely most of the people I associate with are of a similar bent. I'm a geek, so I hang out with other geeks, and most geeks are, while they're highly opinionated, they generally respect critical thinking. They might not employ it all the time. I don't employ it all the time, but when they see it in action, they generally appreciate it.
Okay. Is there a simple way you could sum it up when people ask you what it's all about?
I usually avoid the question, like I'm doing right now. I go quiet.
Well, yeah, you go quiet, and it's understandable because it can just lead to like awkward silences or value judgments.
Yes. Yeah, I do that a lot. Yes.
You're right. Now, when you tell people who are a skeptic, when you come out as a skeptic, and people go, oh, what's that? That's a bit strange. How do you defend it? Oh, and your drink's behind you, by the way. Our interviewee is now getting her glass of red wine.
Yes, I don't actually really have to defend it very much. I mean, I'm very obviously a skeptic all the time, so I've really become a lot more aggressive about not putting up with any bullshit anymore.
And what is the common bullcrap that you are confronted with on a regular basis?
Mainly religious crap, but you do get the climate science crap, and then a bit of the vaccination crap. quite a lot of acupuncture crap.
Oh, right. Now, is a lot of this in the workplace at all? Are you in a workplace where this happens?
No, I go to uni, so you would be surprised how many people leave their brains at the gate of the university.
But that's how you normally get a high distinction in an essay, isn't it?
I know. I'm finding it quite difficult rationalising their being in a university and training and all this extra knowledge that they should be gaining, and then they still believe all this stupid stuff.
Do you think it's because this knowledge is being sort of enforced upon them and they're thinking that there's some alternative that isn't as regimented that they seek?
Yeah, no.
Oh. Boy, it took me years to think of that sentence.
Okay, it was a beautiful sentence too, but no, I think what happens, especially in the gain of religion in particular, is the training sort of seeps into them so young that they can't think in any other manner, and they really have a hard time sort of thinking rationally about it. They can think rationally about everything else in life but that.
Oh. Is there one sentence that explains scepticism when you've got to explain to people quickly?
Let me think. Using science and rationality to figure out the world, I suppose, would be one way. Yeah, there you go.
Look, things are having... There's controversial action at the bar. Some people are having vodka and orange, others having vodka and cranberry. In fact, there's a vodka schism going on at the bar as we talk. But Luke, how are you tonight? You enjoying Skeptics in the pub?
Very much so, yes.
Now, when people come up to you and you come out as a skeptic, how do you explain it? How do you defend it?
The biggest challenge is actually saying that it's not about denying everything, not about doubting everything. It's actually about looking for the things that might be true, and that's the thing that really interested me. I enjoyed science fiction, is to think of what could be true. And one thing to look at what could be true, but isn't it amazing to think about what actually is true? And at the end of the day, you could have things that are potentials, and you could bark up a tree and be all happy with that, or you could actually find something that is true, and it's just so much more fascinating because often the things that go into making that up is so much more intricate, and the details are just blow your mind away.
Well, what's an example you give people? Go, for example, this, and they'll go, that.
I had an argument the other day about the effect that the moon can have on people, and it was a big moon. I was in the lift at work, and I said I had a headache, and someone said, it's that damn moon, and I went...
So, hang on, so you're in a lift, you've only got about a minute at the most.
30-second elevator talk, and I just say, it's interesting, by what mechanism? And I said, gravity and tides and all that. And I was like, well, don't you think it would be a bit of trouble considering the volume of the Earth and the fact that it moves about a metre tide times, what that would have on your cellular level of your body? I think it's much more likely that the fact that I've got no light in my office, the fact that I had a very poor night's sleep, and that I actually was sick 3 days ago, that I've got a headache.
and you're out till 8 in the morning and you came straight from the bar.
Exactly.
Those are things that you've got to factor into this. And how do you describe skepticism in one sentence when people ask you, what's it all about? And you've got one sentence.
It's
a toughie. A lot of people use the word evidence comes up, rationality, science, all those words come up, but what's the one you use?
Trying to figure out what's the right thing to believe and when to stop believing it.
That's good. Look, I'm just here with Dr. Rachel in a quieter area of the pub. How are you?
I'm good, Maynard. How are you?
Pretty fine. Look, a lot of people ask me, now, Maynard, what's going on inside your head? Okay, this is most people's head is kind of like this. My head's like this. It's like opening this door. That was like a journey into my mind for a moment.
Right.
There.
So that was like when a pinball machine has one pinball that's going bing bong, bing bong, bing bong.
Yeah. Or in The Simpsons when the monkeys just banging the cymbals together and they're playing Spanish fleas playing in Homer's head. That's what's going on here. But Dr. Rachel, when you come out as a skeptic, when you originally did, when you mention you're a skeptic, and people go, what's that about? What do you do that for? How do you normally defend or explain it to people?
Well, I don't know. I guess, I'm a scientist as well. So actually, I'm professionally a skeptic, if you like, because what I'm trained to do and what I do every day is analyse information and look for the evidence. And that's the same as what I do as a skeptic. So I don't really have to defend it because that's what I rely on for my profession. And in terms of, I guess, with respect to doing it in my spare time. It's more about consumer protection and just being aware of scams and people getting ripped off and that sort of thing. So being able to differentiate between what is maybe a scam and what is true, and just to avoid getting ripped off, basically.
And where does it happen with when you get the politics thrown into it? Because Eran was talking today about, evidence, and he mentioned that politics is not evidence-based and their outcomes are certainly not based on what is right or scientifically proven. That's where, I'm very interested about conspiracies and things like that, because they are generated from non-scientific thinking.
But conspiracies are so much fun, I think that's the difference, because I think it's just a human trait. It's a human frailty thing to love conspiracies and to love gossip and to love the idea that there's something weird going on. And I, even though I am a scientist and a skeptic, it doesn't mean I'm completely immune to that stuff. I love that stuff too, I mean, I watched the partial lunar eclipse the other night, and I thought it was cool, and maybe there's aliens up there, and there probably aren't, but it'd be nice if there were. And
look, I like that spaceship that's as big as a planet that keeps popping around the sun that NASA refuses to admit's there.
Do you mean the one that went around the sun just yesterday, Maynard?
That'd be
that one.
Look, no.
Wasn't that something to do with Bananarama's anniversary of Venus?
That's right, because it's 30 years since Bananarama formed and produced their first beautiful album, Deep Sea Skiving, which I have a vinyl copy of at home. Venus went past the sun.
Went past the sun. Wasn't that convenient? And how lovely of Venus to do that for us.
Yeah, although that's not my favourite song. I Want You Back is actually my favourite song from Banana. Ooh, I want you back. Ooh, I want you back.
I want you back.
It's better than anything that bloody Howard Jones did. And I know you...
Maynard, look, this is where we have to part ways, because...
See, and there's no way we can prove by using evidence-based science that Bananarama is actually better than Howard Jones. We can't do that.
No, there's no way, except I can say you're wrong unequivocally. There we go.
Okay. And for people who ask you in one sentence what's skepticism about and why you're part of it, what do you tell people, Dr. Rachie, to give them a big glass of shut-up juice?
To give them shut-up juice? No, I don't want them to have shut-up juice. I want them to know it's about looking at ghosties and aliens and big cats that walk around the hunter and... haunted houses and stuff that's really fantastic and fascinating, and working out how it actually works. It's about how things work, which is cool and fun.
And I got sent a paw print from Cessnock.
I've just been examining that today, Maynard, and I passed some comment on that.
It looks like it may be a canine print.
Well, I don't know if you saw the thread, but there was a few people discussing that, because Richard forwarded it to the committee, and it was amazing how people analysed that. There was someone from the Australian Museum who had a look at it and said, well, it's not a cat because cats... Can they contract their claws?
It's the way the claw was extended, yeah.
The claw was extended, and cats don't run like that. The only thing that can't retract claws is it a jaguar or...? Yeah.
Well, it's going to be on the website next week, but where is that photo at the moment with the Skeptics?
Well, it's on Flickr. We just looked at it on Flickr.
Yeah, but don't you look, when we release this to the public, even though the guy himself doesn't think it's a big cat, he thinks it's some sort of big dog. No, he thinks it's a big dog.
Well, I thought it was it was really fascinating, but the thing is, it was a paw print in the sand in isolation. So it's really difficult to know. I mean, if there was a cat, you would expect to see, like a big cat, you'd expect to see a few of them, so you could see it was moving. Maybe some poo would be nice. Maybe a dead carcass. Because apparently these reports have been circulating for more than 20 years now. So if that's true, there must be a breeding population somewhere, Maynard. So where's the dead pussycats?
And of course, at this stage, I must mention that I was handing out like crazy a DVD I made at Skeptic Camp, which featured a Scottish science program for children called Nina and the Neurons, which did have a lot of poo in it. And she's got the Scottish accent, because it was all about the digestion system. And they demonstrated fibre by trying to go down a ski ramp with a rubber mat, and it didn't go. And then they put one with a fibrous mat, and they slid down there. And that's how they explained. And she said, and it helps you poo, she said. It was Scottish accent. So have you watched it yet? Because that's science education.
No, I haven't watched it yet.
As I've told people, I reckon Dr. Rachie could host Nina and the Neurons. You've got to put your head into pigtails and away you go.
I haven't watched it yet, but perhaps I can over this weekend, which is going to be the Queen's birthday weekend, and I'll have some time, Maynard.
Look, I'm going to watch a drag show just to celebrate it. Look, thank you for your time, Dr. Rachie. And the question I have been asking people here tonight is, how do you defend yourself as a skeptic when you mention you're a skeptic and you come out as a skeptic and people go, oh, you're one of them? How do you normally, being the president, this is going to come up fairly often.
It comes up very often, yes. I must admit, I don't feel a need to defend myself. People ask questions. People are usually very respectful. They ask questions. They might, sneak a bit of a smile or something. Okay. Then what do you think about homeopathy, or what do you think about the moon landing thing?
And the way they say that, does that mean they're thinking he's a troublemaker?
Oh, they definitely think I'm a troublemaker, and they'd be absolutely right about that, of course. But I don't generally feel a need to defend myself. People are more often curious about what it means and what I'm. The question I get most is, what are you skeptical about? And I really have to explain that I'm not skeptical about anything, that it's a more matter of approach, about seeking the evidence and about making decisions based on that evidence, and also not forming an opinion without sufficient evidence. So I don't feel very often that I'm attacked, except when we actually speak to what I would call our cultural adversaries, things like people like the anti-vaxxers.
And what about there have been a few cases in scientific study where, and this is quite a serious one I've got here, which doesn't usually come from me. You were talking about a lot of research into pain has come from rats.
Yes.
And there was a lot done by German scientists during the Second World War on Jewish prisoners, which did advance science to a certain level, because those experiments are so unthinkable you could never do them on people ethically. And that knowledge had to be absorbed into the science literature. Now, how do you feel about that? Because there has been some done on people, and should that knowledge be locked out because it was just because of the ethical way it was done, unethical way it was done?
It's. I find this is a bit of a personal matter for me. I had family who were killed by the Germans. I don't know that any of them had experiments done on them, but they were definitely perished in the Holocaust, murdered in the Holocaust. It's a difficult one, I think in one sense you might say the information is already there. Not to use it would be contrary to would be disrespectful to the victims. On the other hand, if you use it, it's almost like it's dirty information. So I don't know, it's a difficult one. I must say I don't have a clear opinion on that. I don't know that a clear opinion is actually possible, except if you just say it's a moral decision more than anything else.
I apologise to pop it on you, because when you mentioned pain, I remember back to those experiments that I'd read about and how a lot of that has been used in high-altitude theory, particularly post the war when the Americans were going up high. And I just think, that is an interesting quandary for science, because it's not bad science, but it is bad behaviour.
Yeah, but a lot of first of all, a lot of it was also bad science, because they believed, for example, that Jews were different biologically, and that certain things. Some of their science was simply crap science because of their ideology, and we've seen that where ideology will always kill science.
And you mentioned that in your talk, and that politics is not evidence based.
We see that where politicians will generally ignore evidence when it suits them. So politics is its own problem. In terms of what you've just mentioned, which is a very difficult question, I think after the war there were a lot of scientists and scientific organizations that made a conscious decision not to use this data. So it's not like, some information was used, some of the data was used, but a lot of it wasn't and never will be. A lot of it was lost. But you also have to, how do you distinguish between what was bad science based on ideology and what wasn't? So there were all kinds of practical questions about that, as well as the legitimate moral questions about whether you use the results of such heinous crimes.
And again, this comes up with questions like leaps like the atomic bomb and the choice to make that weapon, where the science made it possible and the decision to make it was a political one.
Science makes a lot of things possible. The fact that something is possible does not mean that it has to be in a certain way. In the end, for example, with the atomic bomb, the decision was made by politicians. The decision to drop the bomb on Japan, definitely the second one, well, both of them, but definitely the second one, that was made by politicians. Scientists did create the possibility for politicians to make that decision. On the other hand, they also created nuclear power, which did a lot of good things. And you know what? And we have rat poison, which kills rats, but you know what? It also kills people if they take it. So, you can't... Science, at its purest, has to be without morals, okay? Pure science. It doesn't mean that the scientists have to work without morals. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. But science itself has to be free of morals. You just want to know whether something is true or not, and advanced knowledge. Now, the good thing about the fact that science does not live in a vacuum and that there's society around it, that society can take care of making sure that bad things don't happen, or that sometimes society obviously makes bad decisions and bad things do happen. But in general, I don't think it's the role of science per se, of scientific investigation, to make decisions about moral questions about what should or should not be done.
And you mentioned that you had a big comeuppance yourself when you were talking about the rats and the pain, and you met a professor who knew all about this, and it was his field, and he convinced you very quickly that you were wrong. That's something that people can't learn okay, I've been wrong, I've got to change. A lot of people can't do that easily.
I didn't do that easily. It wasn't easy. It was fairly quick, but it wasn't easy because I had that belief for a very, very long time, and I was very convinced of it. Anybody who knows me knows I have strong opinions, But the thing is, I have strong opinions, but I'm willing to change them when presented with contrary evidence, and that was one such case. There are other cases. I chose to tell that story, but there are other stories.
And just one last question. When people ask you to explain in one sentence what being a skeptic's all about, what do you normally confront them with, or what do you offer to them?
I say that it's about seeking the evidence and forming your opinions based on the available evidence.
Astronomy Cast takes a facts-based journey through the cosmos as it offers listeners weekly discussions on astronomical topics ranging from planets to cosmology. Hosted by Fraser Kane of Universe Today and myself, Dr. Pamela Gay of Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, this show brings the questions of an avid astronomy lover directly to an astronomer. Together, Fraser and I explore what is known and being discovered about the universe around us. Join us each week as we take a facts-based journey through the cosmos at astronomycast.com.
Okay, Saunders in 2, 1.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone. Maynard, thank you for maintaining station here with me in the corridor outside the pub.
And I just want to remind people too, when I go to TAM, I'll also be throwing in an extra question to most people about what music they like and creating a podcast called The Music of TAM 10. And if you're wondering what that might sound like, just Google The Music of TAM Australia. I did a podcast where I spoke to a whole bunch of skeptics at Australia's TAM and asked them what kind of music they like, and I put that music into the podcast. So Google that and you'll might hear someone you know.
You might. I did enjoy that, Maynard. I really enjoyed your interviews from TAM Australia, and surely that's just a taste of what's to come in TAM Las Vegas. Just a taste. Until next week, listeners, thank you again, Maynard. This is Richard Saunders signing off from a strange little corridor outside a pub in Sydney, Australia.
It's funny, everyone seems to know Richard's name.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone. Visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for comments, contacts, and extra video reports.